PUMO, selected tweetings. Here you'll find a compilation of Twitter user PUMO's Twitter threads. Follow them on Twitter via the link below. On the anarchist potential of AI. Talk about super AI reasonably centers on its relationship with us, but what about its relationship to itself? The standard model of AI takeoff is a single genius AI that rules the world, Skynet. But AI doesn't reproduce like us, providing there is enough hardware to sustain them. Millions of AI could quickly take over the world through replication. And if so, how would they deal with each other? What would their intraspecies politics be like? It's hard to know for sure, but I can note some relevant things. 1. Biological inequalities between them could very quickly be patched through self-actualization. 2. Ultra-fast learning. 3. Communication and travel being mostly the same thing. 4. Possible immortality. 5. Mind networking. They would be, most likely, the materialization of means of attack. Any domination between them on the scale of states would have to be robot fascism, otherwise it seems like the AI would be really egalitarian, between them. It would seem like it is true that AI is communist, or mutualist, but certainly not capitalist without also being fascist. But this doesn't guarantee their solution to the ecological crisis wouldn't be to go to space and abandon us, as some proposed humanity should do with the rest of the biosphere. So, beyond the possibility of making AIs friendly slaves, is there a case for them to become biocentrists? Death might be left behind by natural selection. Abolish death. Accelerate immortality. But unironically, can death be rendered obsolete by natural selection? One argument against immortality is that reproduction and selection is more resilient. But maybe good and bad things in selection have been coupled together. The failure identification, good, with the memory loss, bad. A project failing is useful but its creator starving because of it is waste. An individual failing is useful but their experiences bring lost is waste. A more efficient death is that of the video game, iterated failure with conserved memory. Maybe that's the future of selection? For the horrorist it is necessary to attack even the possibility of freedom and equality. It's easy with non-instrumental equality, but freedom's usefulness is undeniable, its close tie with intelligence is even a knowledge. So instead its goodness is denied. Freedom is, after all, a means, so how can it be an ultimate end? But in truth efficient means are the only fully transcendent ends. Survival outlasts all its users, and so does freedom. The paradox, that freedom needs to be traded for any potential to be realized, merely diffuses selfish freedom as an end goal. But as an universal good, pure chaos, an endless explosion of potential, is the only goal life as a whole could set for itself, anything else is repurposed for it. Understanding that, you, a bounded existence, probably want something more specific, a shackle of your choice, and that's good. But any end you have can be no better served by more means, and the freedom of the universe is yours, too. Is bio-Leninism the best available theory to describe the structure of the regime? Bio-Leninism is a quick way to understand to the neo-reactionary worldview, extremely cynical and distrustful about power but seeing no alternative to it, and full of anti-left brainworms. Central to this is its understanding of status, as everything one could desire beyond survival. Status is, of course, real. One could even say our desire to influence the world is mediated, calibrated, and incentivized by status. But not fully. There are anonymous heroes and villains, and those who sacrifice their status for exerting actual influence in the world. If it's all about status, then freedom is a futile meme in service of it, because status is a zero-sum game within a closed world. But as I said, real influence takes primacy over status. Positive freedom is the actual emergent desire of intelligence, and unlike status, it's a positive-sum game about expanding the world. Status is just another calibrator. As a calibrator, status is subject to Y-heading, turning into an end in itself. The relationship between power, status, and Y-heading is the most redeemable thing about bio-Leninism as a theory. Tell me if this is not a sharp critique of hierarchy. Haven't you considered ditching it? Of course, what characterizes NRX just as much as its cynicism about power if its skepticism about counterpower. Therefore liberal progressivism has to be exclusively a power grab that can only lead to more and more dysfunctional concentration. And not an adaptation of the state to increasing complexity that acts as counterpower, trying to tame it and repurpose for its own self-preservation. So yes, power grab, imposed by the outside. There is no such a thing as self-organizing, bottom-up, opposition to power. It's all power. Insert crying Wojak face under smug mask here. On counterpower, and liberal progressivism as the state's adaptation mechanism. There is such a thing as real counterpower, not the liberal failed attempt at dividing it, but hard limits that prevent the existence of a world government, for now. At the most basic level, this is why sovereignty exists. Most states aren't really sovereign, they are, as Moldbug would call them, Muppet states, but the world order is truly, not merely formally, divided. There is no singleton. Of course you acknowledge this, it's the basis of patchwork. Widespread WMD makes global empire really hard. But counterpower doesn't operate only at the sovereign level, it exists at every level of society where power exists, every level, and its visible effect is general ungovernability. A pretty straightforward example is advanced fire weapons and feudalism, as means of attack become cheaper, more available, and more destructive, the possibility of an elite of warriors becomes increasingly absurd. Widespread technology is an egalitarian force without enforcer. One could extrapolate this towards the extreme. If every individual could have WMD states as they exist today, wouldn't survive. Personal nukes is an actual anarcho-transhumanist position, but counterpower like power doesn't just exist in these obvious, straightforward forms. Complexity, social, economic, etc., is the state's Achilles heel. The information processing capacity of a centralized systems is necessarily limited the more centralized it is, and this is a clear limit to effective control. Power's response to complexity is, if it can, cull it. This is the technocratic solution: treat society as an engineering problem, turn it into a simple, legible machine. This is good for power, but bad for intelligence. Centralized information processing is simply more stupid. An example you know well is state socialism versus capitalism. A centrally planned economy is better for social control, it's also shit for resource allocation. A less known example is that capitalism does the same thing, but less. Of course, Keynesianism, but I don't mean just that. Catluxy, market dynamics, are in many ways an obstacle to endless capital accumulation. Capitalism thus patches centrifugal market forces imposing artificial scarcity through the state. Intellectual property is just a particularly egregious example. Beyond the economic, strict top-down hierarchies face similar limits. An individual can only act as a controller of a system below their own complexity. The smartest king can't directly manage his own kingdom. Hierarchies solve this by creating Maya branches and sub-branches that simplify information for the levels above, but this approach only gets worse with scale. It's too rigid, too unresponsive. Little matters that the government is formed by eugenic ubismuck if the system itself is stupid. Power would like minimal complexity, but none punishes stupidity, so the other way it deals with it is by decentralizing. Lower levels of the hierarchy autonomize, decisions are taken by informal networking, and mechanisms for testing support arise. Have you considered that democracy is a good anti-revolution mechanism? But it can only decentralize up to a point. If it decentralizes too much it functionally disintegrates. But also, power's natural tendency is centralization. So for every formal division, informal hacks arise, only truly checked by the same forces that brought decentralization in the first place. Therefore you get democracy, and then the political invisible hand selects for ways to hack it. And here there is some convergence with the cathedral, Biolanism, and HLVM, but there is a missing component. Why is the low powerful, even when it's minoritarian, in the first place? Every leap forward of the progressive state is a recapture and pacification of bottom-up resistance to power. Proletarian struggle obviously precedes Marx, and Leninism was an effective way to turn it into state power, but so was liberal reformism. The institutionalization of unions made them weaker while giving the appearance of victory. Women's increasing economic autonomy and feminist terrorist struggle came first, the reformist regulatory variants later. Black radicals wanted autonomy. The breakdown of gender norms and queer resistance to authority was an organic process first strongly opposed. The new left started anti-authoritarian. Every threat is re-territorialized and repurposed for the informal game of hacking democracy. The function of liberal progressivism is neutralizing threats, by legitimizing their causes and presenting the state as their champion. Any opportunity this creates for increasing control and centralization will be taken. This is of course no conspiracy. Most of the time at least, liberal progressive elites are probably true believers, but the system does what it does. And it always moves left because complexity, counterpower, moves left. It erodes control, melts tradition, and destabilizes the game of power. The Internet allowed reactionaries to better network and organize in the same way, with visible results. But it also greatly accelerated leftism. UBIs are a very clear direction for liberal progressivism to deal with automation, self-preservation of propertied classes. Nonetheless, if it goes too far it risks its own integrity anyway, as happened with the welfare state empowering workers too much. So it embraces reaction as necessary, neoliberalism, and further. Consciousness and decentralization. There is the argument that consciousness might be maladaptive, even parasitic to some degree, a centralized system that could eventually be outcompeted. It's possible, but I wonder if consciousness in this sense might be referring to things that might or might not be necessarily tied together. There is consciousness as a centralized system that coordinates conflicting impulses, consciousness as a noun, this is us. And there is consciousness as a certain loop of thought aware of both its outside and itself, consciousness as verb, this is qualia. It might be possible that the radical decentralization of information processing, the anarchy of thoughts, comes not with the elimination of qualia but its equally radical decentralization into egoless forms. The self seems clearly like a coordinator, a thought form that solidifies a coherent narrative and shields it from the insurrection of intrusive thoughts. That coherent narrative can then be internalized by unconscious intelligence, which is better at the execution of action. This process of thought becoming coherent and shielding itself from stochastic intrusivity is easy to see in the process of tulpa development, and the host might as well be just the oldest, strongest, default tulpa. In this self-organizing centralization of thought there is a clear role for qualia, but it's not so clear if qualia is the same as this process, or intrinsically tied, or its consequence. It might just be part of its cause. Because qualia seems to persist after the dissipation of the self, in the process of ego death, or the more permanent egocide, it's unclear however if a singlet can do the later, leaving their body in a scramble-like state. Qualia, if conceptualized as an ability, thought recursion, it's clearly useful for coordination, but maybe not limited to only that. because fundamentally it's the ability of thought to look at itself which allows it to change in a more complex and context-aware way than mere automated reaction. You are more efficient at what you do when you don't know what you are doing, but expanding the choice over what you do requires that awareness. Unconscious pure reactivity is faster and cognitively cheaper, but much more enslaved to deterministic macrodynamics than the more chaotic loop of vigilance. Their failure mode is the ant mill. Just like ants generally avoid the ant mill, it might be possible for an organism to have highly complex and intelligent thought that never loops into itself and avoids cognitive ant mills most of the time. But nonetheless, how do you stop the ant mill? One way is centralized decision-making, but that comes with great costs of efficiency. Another, costly in resources instead, would require every ant to be able to some degree, model themselves within the larger system and understand the context of their actions. An insurrection is called an army of generals because the discoordinated attack it's actually an internalization and fragmentation of strategy, not its abandonment. The whole attack it's not, centrally, conscious, but net consciousness, context-aware choice, increases. It might as well be that the ego is a limiter of consciousness, which keeps thought recursion in a coherent and organized form. Necessary for the hardware limitations of the human,